Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Everyday English Pod. Today we are tackling something that I think a lot of people struggle with, and that is small talk in American English.
Oh, yeah.
It's so important for connecting with people, starting conversations, building confidence in all these social situations that we find ourselves in.
Right. And, it's one of those things that can seem so simple, but it's really such a crucial skill if you want to, navigate these everyday interactions and, build those relationships and feel at ease.
Exactly. And so today we're going to give you some really practical tips and techniques that you'll hear Native American English speakers use to just naturally initiate and maintain these light conversations, these small talk conversations.
Yeah. And what's really cool is we're going to look at it from sort of like a social dynamics perspective so you can understand, the reasoning and the tactics behind it.
Okay, well, let's get started with the first hurdle, right? And that's initiating small talk.
Yeah. So I think one of the easiest ways to get things rolling is to start with just a simple and friendly greeting.
Okay.
And then maybe a quick observation about something that's, happening right around you, like the weather, for instance.
Yeah.
So you could say something like, wow, what a sunny day. Have you been able to get outside yet?
Yeah.
Just natural, easy shows you're friendly and approachable and that you're noticing the same things that they are.
And I love that it's a question, too.
Yes.
So that, instead of just saying, oh, it's sunny out, you're giving them an opportunity to respond. And actually, you're giving them an opportunity to respond with more than just a yes or a no.
That's right.
Which is really key.
Yeah, that's so important because, those open-ended questions are really the best way to get people to share a little bit more and to keep that conversation going.
Yeah.
So instead of just, asking yes or no question like, is it hot out? Or something like that, you could ask something like, how's your day been going? Well, what's keeping you busy these days? What are you working on? Just something that really invites them to share their experiences and to keep that back and forth going.
And it's not just what you say, it's also how you say it and how you present yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm talking about body language here.
Right.
Smiling, making eye contact. These are nonverbal cues.
Yes.
That tell the other person that you are open and ready for a conversation. And even just, simply nodding your head while they're speaking shows that you're listening to them.
Right.
And that just encourages them to keep going, because small talk is not a monologue. It's a back and forth.
Yeah, it's definitely a two-way street. And, being a good listener is key.
Yes.
And one really good way to show that you're listening is to repeat or comment on something that they just said.
Okay.
Like if they mentioned that they're trying out a new recipe, you could say, oh, that's cool. What kind of dish are you making?
Right.
And it just, keeps things moving and shows that you're engaged.
And I think it's important to remember, too, as we're, just getting started with the conversation here, that we want to keep things light.
Okay.
We want to keep them positive. And especially in those initial moments of small talk, we want to avoid anything that's controversial or, too personal or too heavy.
Yeah.
So sticking to those common positive interests is usually a pretty good bet.
Right.
Things like travel, hobbies, current events, those are usually safe topics.
Yeah, and they can open up a lot of different avenues for, fun and easygoing chats.
Yeah.
So something like, have you seen any good movies recently?
Yeah.
Or are you enjoying this weather?
Yeah.
Something just lighthearted.
And so what we're really saying here is that, the goal of small talk, it's not just to fill a silence.
Right. It's about building a connection.
Yes.
It's about showing that you're genuinely interested in the other person and creating this little, moment of human connection.
Okay. So now we have a pretty good idea about how to get started with small talk. But how do you know? How does that change depending on the situation that you're in?
Well, you can definitely tailor the way you kick off a conversation to the specific context.
Right.
So let's say you're at a party, for example.
Okay.
And you don't really know that many people. A really natural way to start is just by saying something like, hi, I'm your name. How do you know the host? It's just a really simple icebreaker that, relates to the situation that you're both in. And it gives you this kind of shared starting point for a conversation.
Makes sense. What about in a more professional setting?
Yeah. So at work, for example.
Yeah.
Around the coffee machine. Or during a break.
Yeah.
You could say something like, how's your week been going so far?
Yeah.
It's a nice casual way to connect with your colleagues and, start building a little bit of rapport.
Okay, that's a good one. Yeah.
What about in more public everyday scenarios?
Okay, so in public places.
Yeah.
You can often use what's around you as a natural icebreaker.
Right.
So, for example, let's say you're waiting at a bus stop and the bus is late. You could turn to someone nearby and say, "This bus seems to be running a little behind schedule today. Do you take this route often?"
Yeah. Or if you're in a park, you could say, "It's such a peaceful spot, isn't it?" It's just, using your surroundings to invite a conversation in a really low pressure kind of way.
What if you're traveling?
Okay, so when you're traveling, or let's say you're at an airport,
Okay.
where are you headed today?
Yeah.
It's a friendly question, and it often leads to some interesting stories about, travel plans and destinations.
It does. What about at those more formal events or conferences?
Oh, yeah. So at events and conferences,
Yeah.
you can connect with people by finding common ground in the shared experience. So you could ask something like, "What did you think of the speaker?" Or, "Are you attending any other sessions today?" Those types of questions that kind of start with what you have in common.
Yeah.
You're there for the same reason.
Right. And I think this one's a good one too, and I think a lot of people probably appreciate this, and that is giving a compliment.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a really great way to break the ice, to start a conversation. And, so saying something like, "I really love your scarf. Where did you get it?" can be a really nice way to strike up a conversation. But of course, it's got to be genuine.
Yes, absolutely.
You can't just feel like you're trying to say something nice.
It has to be authentic.
Yeah. It has to come from a genuine place.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we have all these great ways to get the conversation started.
Right.
But how do you keep it going after those first couple of sentences?
Okay, so this is where being observant and really listening to what the other person is saying comes into play.
Okay.
So remember our cafe example where we were talking about the coffee?
Yeah.
You could build on that by saying something like, "This place really does have great coffee. Have you been coming here for a while?"
Right.
And then here's the important part. You need to really listen to their answer
Okay.
and ask a follow-up question.
So you're not just saying that.
Well,
You're actually genuinely interested in the response.
exactly. So if they say, "Yeah, I have," you could say, "Oh, cool. Was your usual here?"
Okay.
Just something that shows that you're engaged and that you're actually listening to what they're saying.
So it's really about building on those little moments of connection.
That's right.
And then from there, you can kind of see where it goes.
Yeah. And another good tip for keeping the conversation going is to focus on the other person.
Yeah.
People love talking about themselves
Yeah.
and their interests. So asking questions like, "What do you like to do in your free time?"
Right.
Or, "Have you always lived in this area?" Can make the interaction feel a lot more personal.
Okay. I like those. And what about when they ask you a question back?
Yes.
How do you respond to that?
Okay, so instead of giving just like a one-word answer, try to add a little detail or elaboration.
Okay.
So, for example, if someone asks, "How are you doing?" instead of just saying, "Fine,"
Okay.
you could say, "I'm doing well. Thanks. I just got back from a quick trip to the beach. How about you?" Just something that, gives them a little more to work with.
Right. Right.
And encourages them to ask you more questions.
Okay, so we're building on things. We're giving detail. What about adding in a little personality?
Yes,
Can we add a little humor to small talk?
absolutely. Humor is a fantastic way to make small talk more enjoyable.
Okay.
A gentle joke or a funny observation can really help people relax and connect.
Right.
So, for instance, if it's raining really hard, you could say something like, "Looks like I should have brought my swimsuit instead of an umbrella today."
I like it. But of course, you have to be a little bit careful with humor.
Oh, yes, definitely.
What one person finds funny, another person might find offensive.
Right.
Or just not funny.
Right. Everyone has a different sense of humor.
Right.
So if you're not really sure about the other person's sense of humor,
Yeah.
it's best to keep the jokes really light and pretty universal.
Okay.
Or you can always stick to those more neutral topics like hobbies, recent events, travel plans, things that are less likely to cause any kind of misunderstanding.
Right, right. And what about if you have the feeling that the other person is a little bit shy or just not super outgoing?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes you can just tell when someone's a little more reserved.
Yeah.
So in those situations, it's important not to rush the conversation.
Okay.
Give them a little space to feel comfortable
Yeah.
and let them open up at their own pace.
Right.
A calm and patient approach can really make a difference.
Yeah. Okay, so we're starting conversations, we're keeping them going. But what about when things hit a bit of a snag?
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk about some of those small talk challenges.
Those little bumps in the road
Yeah.
that we all encounter. So what do you do when you just straight up run out of things to say?
Okay, so if you find yourself in that situation,
Yeah.
a really good tactic is to fall back on asking the other person a question.
Okay.
An open-ended question.
Yeah.
That shifts the focus back to them.
And gives you something new to talk about.
Okay.
So you could say something like, "So what have you been up to lately?" Or what's keeping you entertained these days?
Yeah.
Just, something that allows them to share and opens up a new avenue for conversation.
Okay. And what about those awkward silences?
Oh, yeah.
Those can feel like they last forever.
It can feel like an eternity.
Yes.
But the key is not to panic.
Okay.
Just take a breath, maybe offer a little smile, and make a light observation about your surroundings.
Okay.
So you could say something as simple as, it's a lot busier in here than I expected.
Right.
Or,
Yeah.
I love the music they're playing. Just anything to break that silence in a casual way.
Okay. And then there's those people who give you really short answers. You try to start a conversation with them and they're just not giving you much.
Right.
What do you do?
Okay. So if you're getting a lot of those short answers, you can try switching to even more open-ended questions.
Okay.
Ones that really encourage them to elaborate.
Right. Yeah.
So, for example, instead of saying, do you like your job? You could say, what's something you find really interesting about what you do?
Okay.
Give them a chance to really share.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to be aware that sometimes people just aren't in the mood to chat.
Right.
Or they might be really busy or distracted.
Yeah.
So if you try a couple of those open-ended questions and you're still getting those short answers,
Okay.
it's totally fine to gracefully end the conversation.
Okay.
You can say something like, well, it was nice talking with you. I hope you have a great day.
Yeah.
Just keep it light and polite and move on.
And no hard feelings.
Exactly.
Okay. What about cultural differences?
Oh, yes.
Because the rules of small talk can be different in different parts of the world.
Absolutely.
So how do you navigate that?
Yeah. That's a really important consideration.
Yeah.
In some cultures, it's perfectly normal to talk about, personal things right away.
Right.
Whereas in other cultures, people might prefer to stick to more neutral topics initially.
Right.
So if you're not really sure about someone's background, it's always a good idea to start with those safer topics.
Yeah.
Like travel, food, hobbies, current events, things that are less likely to be, culturally sensitive.
And you mentioned earlier, too, about paying attention to body language.
Yes.
And I think that's important for both understanding how the other person is feeling,
Yeah.
but also making sure that you're giving off the right signals as well.
Yeah. And if someone seems distracted, they're not making eye contact, they have closed off body language.
Yeah.
It could just be that they have a lot on their mind. They might not be in the mood to talk.
Right.
So it's really important to respect those cues and just, politely end the conversation.
Yeah. And don't take it personally.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, and finally, I think this is a big one for a lot of people that I talk to, is this idea of perfection, They feel like they have to say the exact right thing, or, they get flustered if they make a mistake.
No.
And, it's just really important to remember that small talk is not about being perfect. It's about connecting with another human.
Exactly.
So just relax, be yourself.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to make a few mistakes along the way.
It's all about the effort you're making, to connect.
Yes.
And most people are really going to appreciate that.
Yes.
More than, perfect grammar or delivery.
So let's look at some real world examples to bring this all together.
Okay.
And just make it really clear. So let's imagine you're at a party.
Okay. At a party, you could say, this is a great party. Do you know a lot of people here? It's a nice open-ended question that gets the other person talking.
Okay. And what if you're at work and you've just been introduced to someone?
Okay. In that case, you could say something like, hi, it's nice to meet you. I'm your name. What department are you in?
Yeah.
This is a simple way to get to know them a little better.
And at a more casual get-together, maybe where there's food involved?
Oh, yes. Food is always a good topic.
Yeah.
You could say, those name of food look delicious. Have you tried one yet?
Yeah.
It's just a casual, friendly way to start a conversation.
Okay, good one. What about if you're just stuck waiting in line somewhere, like at the post office or a coffee shop?
Okay, in a line, you could comment on the shared experience.
Okay.
So you could say, this line is moving pretty slowly today. Looks like everyone has errands to run.
Yeah.
Or, I'm really craving that coffee. What about you?
Yeah.
Just something light and relatable.
Okay. At a more formal networking event, what would you say?
So at a networking event, you want to be a little bit more direct.
Okay.
But still polite.
Right.
So you could try something like, so what brings you to this event today?
Okay.
It's a good way to get people talking about their professional interests and goals.
Yeah, and if you're traveling and you want to strike up a conversation with someone.
Okay, if you're traveling, you could ask, have you been to this city before? Do you have any recommendations for things to see?
Yeah.
People love to share their travel experiences.
Yeah, and what if you want to share a little bit about yourself without dominating the conversation?
Okay, you could say something like, I'm actually trying to learn a little bit of Spanish on the side, It's been a lot of fun, but it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
What about you? Do you have any hobbies that you're really passionate about?
Okay, so you're keeping it interactive. You're showing interest in them as well.
Exactly.
Now, what about those situations where you say something and you just get a really unexpected or maybe even tricky response?
Oh, yeah. Those can be a little bit awkward.
Yeah.
But, there are ways to handle them gracefully.
Okay, so what do you do if someone just seems completely uninterested in talking to you?
Okay, in that situation, the best thing to do is just politely back off.
Yeah.
You could say something like, well, I don't want to keep you. It was nice meeting you.
Right.
Or I'll let you get back to what you were doing. Have a great day. Just, acknowledge that they might not be in the mood to chat and move on.
Yeah, no harm, no foul.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about those people who just give you really short one-word answers?
Yes.
Like we were talking about before.
Okay, well, you can try asking one or two more of those really open-ended questions.
Okay.
Like, what's the most interesting thing you've done this week?
Right.
Just to see if you can get them to open up a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're still giving you those one-word answers, it's probably best to just politely end the conversation.
Right.
And, it's not personal.
Yeah.
Some people are just more talkative than others.
Right. And we also talked about, really paying attention to those nonverbal cues.
Absolutely.
And, if you're picking up on those signals
Yes.
that maybe they're not interested or they're distracted, don't force it.
Right.
Just politely excuse yourself.
You could say, well, I should let you get back to what you were doing. It was nice chatting with you. Or, I'm going to go grab another drink. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Right. Just keep it light and casual.
Exactly.
Now, sometimes I find that sharing a brief personal story can help keep the conversation going.
Oh, yeah. Stories are great.
Yeah.
Because they help you connect with people on a more personal level.
Right.
So you could say something like, I tried making sourdough bread for the first time last weekend, and it was a complete disaster. Have you ever had any funny cooking feel? Just a little anecdote that makes you relatable and opens up the conversation for them to share their own experiences.
And what about using humor to smooth over those awkward moments?
Oh, humor could be such a great tool.
Yeah.
Even a simple comment like, I'm running on fumes today, definitely need more coffee, can just, lighten the mood.
Right.
And create a little bit of common ground.
Okay, and a genuine compliment, as we mentioned before,
Yes.
can really go a long way
Absolutely.
in changing the direction of a conversation.
It shows that you're paying attention and that you're genuinely interested in the other person.
Right.
So you could say something like, that's a really cool watch. I've been thinking about getting one like that.
Right.
Or, you have a great sense of style. I love your outfit.
Yeah, and I think most importantly, we can't forget about the power of just being a good listener.
Oh, absolutely. That's key.
Really paying attention to what the other person is saying, nodding, making eye contact, and saying things like, that's interesting, or tell me more about that.
Right.
Those are all signs that you're engaged and that you value what they have to say.
And that makes the other person feel heard.
Yes.
And it just helps the conversation flow more naturally.
Okay, so we've touched on this a little bit already, but let's talk in more detail about adapting your small talk style to different situations.
Okay.
So work events, for example.
Yes. At work events, you want to keep things professional, but still approachable. So neutral questions like, how long have you been with the company? Or what do you think of the new office space? Those are good starting points.
Okay, what about those more casual, laid-back get-togethers with friends?
Okay, so in those settings, you can definitely go for lighter, more personal topics.
Right.
Like, have you been watching any good shows lately? Or what did you do this weekend?
Right.
Sharing personal stories is also a great way to connect with people on a more deeper level.
Yeah.
And just being observant, noticing things like a new haircut or a cool piece of jewelry, and offering a genuine compliment can be a really nice way to strike up a conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's important, too, to just be mindful of people's boundaries.
Yeah.
If someone seems reserved or they're giving you those short answers,
Right.
just respect that.
Don't force it.
Yeah.
Not everyone is in the mood to chat all the time.
Right. What about at those big outdoor events like a street fair or a festival?
Oh, those are fun. Yeah. You can comment on what's happening around you. So you could say, have you tried any of the food from that truck over there?
Yeah.
I heard it's amazing.
Yeah.
Or the music is really great, isn't it?
Right. And at a sporting event.
Okay. At a sporting event, you could ask, who are you rooting for?
Yeah.
It's a classic icebreaker, especially if you find someone who's cheering for the same team.
Right. Those high fives are always a good connector.
Exactly.
What about those more, business-oriented conferences that you go to?
Okay, so at conferences, you want to keep it professional but still engaging.
Mm-hmm.
So you could ask something like, what's been the most valuable thing you've learned so far at the conference? Or what are you hoping to get out of this event?
Right.
Just, questions that show that you're both there for a similar purpose.
And we talked about quieter places like libraries or museums.
Yes. In those settings, you want to be respectful of the quiet atmosphere. So a whispered comment about a particular exhibit or the peaceful ambiance can be a nice way to acknowledge someone without disturbing others.
Okay. And humor can work in a lot of different situations.
Oh, absolutely.
But you just have to kind of tailor it to the context.
Right.
So a lighthearted remark about a long line, for example, that could work in a lot of different places.
Exactly.
And I think, commenting on shared experiences in general is a really easy way to start a conversation.
Yes, it creates this instant connection.
Right.
So if you're in a crowded elevator, you could say something like, well, this is cozy.
Right.
Or if you're both struggling to open an umbrella in the wind, you could say, this wind is crazy today. Just little observations that show that you're in it together.
Right. And pets are always a good conversation starter.
Oh, yes. If you see someone with a cute dog in the park,
Yeah.
you can almost always start a conversation by saying, your dog is adorable. That's their name.
Yeah, people love talking about their pets.
They do.
And travel is another great opportunity for small talk.
Absolutely.
If you're on a plane or a train or you're visiting a new city, you can ask someone, is this your first time here? Or, what are you most looking forward to seeing? Yeah, people love sharing their travel tips and experiences.
And even in professional environments, you can weave in your hobbies and interests in a casual way.
Right.
So if a colleague mentions that they had a great weekend, you could follow up with, oh, that sounds fun. What do you like to do in your free time?
Okay, and we can't forget about the simple power of a compliment.
Yes, a genuine compliment can go a long way.
Yeah.
So in a professional setting, you could say, I really enjoyed your presentation. It was very clear and informative.
Right.
Or, you handled that meeting really well. I was impressed.
Yeah, and remember to keep your tone friendly and approachable. Make eye contact, nod your head to show that you're listening.
Right.
And don't be afraid to share a little bit about yourself, too, if it's relevant to the conversation. And if you're ever at a loss for words, the weather is always a safe fallback.
It is. It's a classic for a reason.
And when it's time to wrap things up,
Yes.
just end on a friendly note,
Right.
Something like, it was great talking with you, or have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, those are perfect.
So what are some of the key strategies that we can really focus on to just improve our small talk skills overall?
Okay, so I would say active listening is probably the most important.
Okay.
So really pay attention to what the other person is saying. Ask those follow-up questions.
Right.
Nod your head, make eye contact. All of those things show that you're engaged. Sharing little personal stories can also help you build a connection.
Right.
But don't be afraid of a little silence.
Okay.
You don't have to fill every second with words.
Right.
Sometimes a comfortable pause can be a good thing.
Right. And practice makes perfect.
Absolutely.
So the more you practice your small talk skills in those situations where you feel comfortable, the more confident you'll become.
Right.
It's also a good idea to have a few general topics in mind, so that you're not completely drawing a blank.
Yeah, have a few go-to questions.
Yeah.
But also be flexible and let the conversation flow naturally.
Yeah. Don't try to force it.
Exactly.
And pay attention to body language,
Yes.
both yours and the other person's. A friendly smile, open posture, nodding your head.
Yeah.
Those are all signs that you're approachable and engaged.
And use humor appropriately.
Yeah.
To keep things light and fun.
And a genuine compliment.
Yes.
That's always a good way to make someone feel good.
It is.
And to make a positive connection.
And of course, be mindful of cultural differences. What's considered appropriate small talk in one culture might be different in another.
Right. Okay. So let's look at a few more specific situations.
Okay.
Just to give some examples. So what about online meetings, which are so common these days?
Okay. So for online meetings, you can start with a friendly greeting. You can even comment on someone's background if it's interesting.
Right.
You can ask a question like, how's the weather where you are?
Yeah.
And you can also use a little bit of humor to help people relax and feel more comfortable.
What about when you're in those more public, everyday settings?
Okay, so in public places, like a park or cafe,
Yeah.
just making a simple observation, about your surroundings
Right.
can be a great conversation starter.
Yeah.
So you could say something like, the flowers in this park are beautiful.